Now, turning to our program, I'm pleased to welcome our speakers today, Vincent Lyles and Pertl. I will provide a little background on Vincent, who will then introduce Jeff and the rest of the program. Vincent is the Executive Director of Milwaukee Succeeds, where he assists in leading a coalition of over 100 organizations, including educators, nonprofits, businesses, philanthropy, government, and residents with lived experience, working together to transform systems and deliver long-term equitable results for Milwaukee's youth. Prior to his role at Milwaukee Succeeds, he held leadership positions at Advocate Aurora Health, the Boys and Girls Clubs of Greater Milwaukee. Vincent's educational background includes a bachelor's degree and a Juris Doctorate from University of Wisconsin, where he developed a strong foundation in law and public policy. Please join me in welcoming Vincent Lyles and Pertl.
Well, got my little notes out here. Good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to be with you. I was a member of this club for just a short time, but enjoyed the opportunities to have these Tuesday afternoon discussions. So we're going to have one of those. Thank you, Beth, for that introduction. You know, all those jobs means as my mother used to say, I can't keep a job. So I am glad to be with you all today. I'm glad to be a part of Milwaukee Succeeds and the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. We have been at this since 2012, trying to figure out how we can support early childhood education. And throughout that tenure, we have had a great friend in Tony Evers. When Tony Evers was the superintendent of education in Wisconsin, he was an advocate for, obviously, education, but early childhood education was important to him at that time. And his partner in crime at that time was Pertl. Jeff and I got a chance to meet each other a few years ago. And I was just blown away by his commitment, his tenacity, his creativity. And obviously, as you all can imagine, in Madison, just like in Washington, D.C., and Springfield, Illinois, and all these different places, yes, there's the elected person, but there's a person who actually gets all the work done. And Jeff is one of those people. So let's talk a little bit about Jeff's career. He is currently the Secretary for the Department of Children and Families, which is one of the largest departments in state government. He's previously served as a supervisor for the Dane County Board of Supervisors. So he's also a past elected official, so he knows a little bit about how the sausage gets made. Senior policy advisor to Superintendent Evers, as I mentioned earlier, 2009, 2018. And then he is also a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, Madison. All you Badger fans, come on now. He took a little break, though, and went to UC Berkeley, and on his way back home, he decided he wanted to work and serve us in Wisconsin. He's also my neighbor, living in Wauwatosa. So without further ado, we bring you Pertl. Thank you, Vincent. So what I thought we'd do today, we've got about 25 minutes. What I thought we'd do today is talk a little bit about the historic significance of the 2025-2027 state budget, because for the first time in Wisconsin's history, there is a direct line item in the state budget now around early childhood education. That's significant. In total, there was a commitment of about $360 million, 380, you know, big numbers, they're all the same. Budget math, historic nonetheless, including $110 million of direct payments. You all may have heard during COVID that early childhood education and childcare was deemed as essential because people need to go back to work. And the federal government provided support for providers to be able to keep those centers open. And June 30 of 2025, that money essentially went away. And with the foresight that Governor Evers has, he proposed in the state budget that we maintain the funding at the current level that the feds had done. And, you know, we did, he also said that back in the 24 budget as well. I'm getting my numbers wrong. But nonetheless, it didn't happen then, but it happened this time. So there's $110 million coming in direct payments to early childhood providers. There's the launch of a school readiness program, 4K school readiness program that will involve our early childhood education kiddos and providers across the state of Wisconsin. So very excited about that. There was a change in terms of the age level for the, I would call it the training and development of early childhood education providers down to age 16. So very excited about that in terms of workforce initiative. And so today we're going to talk about all those things and try and keep it in the context of kind of affordability and quality and access. Because everybody in this room, every single person in this room, in part is successful because when you were a little bitty baby, somebody grabbed you by the hand and said, you're going to be successful. You're going to be successful. And that's what early education does for our kids. It helps them dream about being successful. So with that, I'll turn to Jeff and get started here with a couple questions. Secretary Pertl, can you walk us through the most impactful changes in early childhood education policy that was included in this budget?
Yeah, let me level set first a little bit of the landscape. Like, why do we care about this? And frankly, why is it different today than maybe when I was growing up? And I think a lot about, I was born in the late 70s. And when that happened, about half of moms are in the workforce and about half of two-parent households have both parents working. Now, when I have kids, 3/4 of moms are in the workforce and 2/3 of two-parent households have both parents working. We're in a very different sort of economic and workforce situation a generation later. And there's a lot of changes going on in that space. I have two boys who were adopted at birth. They are 7 and 11. One started middle school this week. All kinds of things going on in our house. And if I'd had kids when my mom had me, my kids would be in college now, right? So we see this shift of people having fewer kids, they're having them later, they're doing different things, and it's shifting sort of the landscape of both work and family in need. And so when we hit the pandemic, the day after the stay-at-home order was issued, we were all the agencies were on a call with the major hospital associations, and we talked about three things. We talked about ventilators, we talked about personal protective equipment, and we talked about childcare. And they were very clear that to run the healthcare system, they needed a place, not just for the doctors and the nurses, but for the admin, the custodial folks. Everybody needed a safe place for their kids to go. And during the pandemic, childcare stayed open. But childcare is a very challenging business to be in. It is incredibly expensive for parents. The average price of childcare around the state is over $16,000 a year now. 4 years of college is cheaper than 4 years of childcare. Of course, you would finance higher education. You would finance buying a house or buying a car. But childcare, you're going to pay every week out of your pocket. Right? So it's a big burden on families for affordability. In fact, for families in the largest markets, including Madison and Milwaukee, on average, 40% of income can get tied up in the cost of housing and 30% of income per kid on childcare. So a family of 4 with 2 kids in childcare, in theory, at the median, doesn't have enough money to pay the heat, put gas in the car, food on the table. You know, that is not a system that is going to thrive a middle class. And so when we think about how we want to tackle this generational issue, it's really about building out a system of support and access and affordability for childcare for people all across the income spectrum so that they can go to work and trust that their kids are in a safe, high-quality place where they're going to learn, be loved, and develop. And that's really sort of undergirding all of this. And so it kind of plays out in 3 acts. The first act was the pandemic, as Vincent said. One of the first things, and I should just, for context, historically the state doesn't really invest directly in childcare. We regulate childcare and we run what's called Wisconsin Shares, which is a subsidy program for low-income families to be able to attend childcare. It's like a voucher program. About 20% of families statewide participate in Wisconsin Shares. Half of those kids live here in Milwaukee. But most families are paying the full cost of childcare. And when the pandemic hit and childcare was in crisis, the governor made the decision using those federal funds to, for the first time, directly provide investment in childcare to stabilize the industry. And we did that. We kept the doors open. There's a lot of turnover in childcare. Childcare is a small business model. It's one of the 3 largest women-owned small business sectors in Wisconsin. It's restaurants, beauty salons, and childcare. All right? But we see a lot of turnover. There's about 4,200 childcare providers in the state of Wisconsin. About a quarter of them will close every year. Okay, so that's a lot of churn. So some are real stable, but a lot of turnover. And so that longevity is important, that stability is important. And what we see over time is sort of a shift towards larger childcare centers. They got better economies of scale. They can pay better wages. Sometimes they can pay benefits. But that also means fewer locations. So more capacity and fewer spots, that can create access issues, particularly in rural Wisconsin. So in this first act of innovation, there's direct investment, more like what we see in schools, not at that level, for childcare. And that's a transformational thing. As Vincent said, the governor proposed making that a permanent part of the state budget. The legislature didn't do that at that point, and so he called back a bunch of federal money and he extended that investment 2 more years, although at half as much money, to sort of bridge us to this current budget. And that's sort of the second act of this story. And I called it the great compromise. The governor said, he called it the year of the kid, and he sort of drew a line around higher education, particularly UW, K-12, and childcare as his priorities in the budget. Republican leaders identified a suite of sort of tax changes and cuts that they wanted to put in place. And people did good old-fashioned negotiation for a long time. They talked, then they didn't. And would they, won't they? They did. They came to an agreement at the very end. Maybe not exactly what everybody wanted, but that is, as the governor likes to say, the nature of compromise. But it put in some permanent pieces, to Vincent's point here, into childcare. So it extended these provider investments for 1 year. That's going to be a challenge in the second year of the biennium. In Wisconsin, we do 2-year budgets. So we got 1 year of provider funding. And then we're going to transition to some state programs that are a little more targeted. It's the first time, as Vincent said, there's going to be a state investment. One is called Get Kids Ready, which is basically, if you think about what 4-year-old kindergarten is in schools, it's funding sort of a 4-year-old program on the childcare side. And this is really important, especially someone who spent a long time in education. We really promoted the expansion of 4-year-old kindergarten, and I believe in the power of 4-year-old kindergarten. And it is economically devastating to childcare. When you move the 4-year-olds out of the childcare system and into the public school system, what you're doing is you're taking the least expensive kids with the most flexible ratios, and you're leaving behind the 3-year-olds, the 2-year-olds, the 1-year-olds that have the tightest staffing ratios, but the highest cost, and that breaks the economic model. And over time, we've seen a lot of turnover and a lot of closure because there's just not enough kids to sustain traditionally the costs of childcare. And that doesn't mean 4-year-old kindergarten's bad, but it is a systems approach we need to think about how do we make these things work and how does affordability work if you don't have the same mix of kids. The reason we wanted a lot of 4-year-olds in schools is for education, but it's also helping rural schools in areas of declining enrollment sustain, but that there were trade-offs to that. So we created this 4-year-old program. The other big thing that folks did in that Wisconsin Sheriff's program is they created the first targeted incentives for infant and toddler care. So if you're in the Sheriff's program and you serve infants and toddlers, you get an enhanced payment now. The greatest demand for childcare is for kids under 2. Folks want to return to work. They have the smallest ratios, and therefore the fewest spots. And it is a huge demand, and we're trying to sort of change and build out, again, how do you fix the economics of this childcare system when you have more expensive kids and not the same mix? So 2 really big things that happened, but forget all that for a second. What really happened was, for the first time, childcare sat at the same table that education and higher education did as part of a system that supports kids as a cornerstone of the state budget, and that is the big change. This idea that we are now at a point where childcare is part of this way that we support kids at scale. There was a time when we had 1-room schoolhouses, and we built common school fund and common schools in districts, and we grew a system that met our educational and our workforce needs as the world changed. We're doing the same thing in childcare, and we're in those early stages, and I'm excited to see what that third act has for it.
Yeah. So, Jeff, when you think about these changes, what does that mean for DCF, your department, your people? You're at the big kid table now. What's that mean?
Well, it's interesting. So we run an array of kids programs. We do child welfare, we do workforce programs, we do child support. That's actually the biggest thing that the agency does in terms of the volume of dollars and the number of people it touches. In childcare, in what it really, when we came into the administration before the pandemic, we really thought the transformations that were going on in the child welfare system would be the biggest piece of work that would sort of occupy our time. And there have been some really amazing and important things that have changed in how we do child welfare, how we serve kids. We have half as many kids in out-of-home care today as we did 15 years ago, and some real progress in those areas. But it's really shifted the focus of work to childcare. And what I would say is a big fundamental question. There is not a question about do we or do we not do something about childcare. The real question is are we going to sort of let the present trends continue, or are we going to take action to change course? And in the present trend, we see high turnover, low wages, and frankly, a shift. Childcare is historically an essential good, like groceries, like healthcare, but it's not necessarily a public good like schools, right? The taxing authority and districts and structures. But over time, what we see happening is more relationships between childcare and schools, either school districts, technical colleges, the move to 4K, are we going to go to 3K? Are we eventually going to create a system on the public side rooted in schools and technical colleges and systems? Or are we going to continue to be sort of a small business center-based infrastructure? And then how are you going to finance it? How do you get to a point that is stable and structural? And it's probably a mix of direct supports and payments to sort of build the floor, meaningful, probably middle-class subsidies, more like you see in higher education, to make childcare affordable. It is not affordable for a middle-class family today to have kids in childcare, and that is a problem. You probably need a different array of tax incentives for businesses. We see some growth in the dependent care flex plans, those pre-tax things like a health savings account, but for childcare, and how do businesses partner on that? And how do we modernize the regulations to make childcare sort of meet the needs both for health and safety, but also to function at scale in big places and in small places, whether it's in-home or in a center. And I think that's the body of work now.
That's a great point, and I think for a lot of folks in this room, those subsidies, those credits are certainly important. But one of the other things you talked about, and I think it's critical for our discussion today, is the workforce shortage, right? At the end of the day, you still need someone to take care of those kiddos. And, you know, like in other industries, other sectors, we have an aging population, obviously. We have people who are shying away from education as a career profession. So talk a little bit about what you see in this budget and what you're thinking about in the future that can, like I'll say, spur more folks considering early childhood education.
Well, I think there's probably three big pieces to think about there. I mean, one is wages. Wages are low. You're averaging probably $13 an hour in home care, maybe 16 if you work in a center. So, you know, you're almost always better off working at Quick Trip or Costco than you are working in childcare. And this is true of a lot of care-based industries. You're almost always going to be eligible for public benefits. It's not a family supporting career. And a lot of the structures around childcare historically flow around two-parent incomes and sort of this somewhat older model of there's a primary breadwinner and then someone's working in childcare. I don't know that economic model is true at scale anymore, and we see it being increasingly challenging for folks. And the folks that are making it work, you know, they generally have a higher other income that's carrying them through. So you need to have a sustainable wage structure. And those childcare counts payments that we made, half of it had to be used on salaries and support for staff. And I think that's an important policy piece. We need to be competitive in pay, or we're simply not going to have people that choose that field. So that's a component of this. You know, I think the second piece in terms of workforce is we tend to put a really high premium on bachelor's degrees. A lot of early childhood educators have an associate's degree from the technical college. It's amazing training. They do a great job. You can get training in a lot of different ways to be in childcare. But one of the things about early education programs that have a bachelor's degree is they tend to focus on kindergarten through third grade, with a heavy emphasis on reading, which from our education days is really important. But in early care and education, when we got the kids to 4 and 5, we're doing pre-literacy. We're doing socio-emotional development, numbers, letters, emotional identification. Both my kids were toilet trained in childcare, right? They're these very fundamental things. And the associates program is faster, cheaper, and better, I would argue, in getting people ready. And I think valuing that credential in an equal or higher way is actually a really important part of moving this industry forward. There's a danger that we over-regulate, over-credential the space, and that makes it very hard for people to actually get those jobs and do that work. I think the other thing that we can do that can help with workforce is, as we talk about this idea of a middle class subsidy, New Mexico does this. I'm really watching to see what happens with them relative to their neighboring states. But if we started to provide some subsidy for middle class families, especially if we're doing a lot on the flex account side for helping pay the out-of-pocket cost, what kind of competitive advantage would it create for our state? Think about as a benefit. My childcare bills are real high for 2 kids, right? So if you're talking about families sometimes paying $30,000 a year out of pocket for childcare, if the state was picking up even 80% of that tab in a subsidy, think about what a difference that makes in terms of the wages, the net income that people are going to have and their ability to spend and pay compared to our neighbors. It could really anchor families into the state. It could be a huge boon for our recruitment compared to what other states are doing. And I think there's a smart workforce strategy there, both for childcare, but actually for the larger workforce needs of the state.
Yeah. So if you don't mind, talk a little bit about what you've seen some of the other states doing. That might be interesting for this audience to know.
Yeah, so like I said, New Mexico has really done this very interesting program about sort of moving into middle class subsidy. We've got states in the Northeast that are doing more like we did, so direct provider payments, and that have stabilized some of the turnover for folks. And again, I think increasingly there's a global conversation. When I'm talking to business leaders, there are a lot of businesses that are just paying sort of out-of-pocket, taxable bonuses, frankly, to people to be able to pay for childcare. It's not a terribly efficient way to do it. There are more streamlined ways that we could help reduce cost for families using these flex accounts. It's hard for businesses to navigate that stuff. The thing I hear the most from folks is, we tried to get in and build childcare on site. It was hard. We didn't understand it. It's not our business. Then we tried buying slots, but that's expensive. They're not always used. What can we do? And I think starting to think about both childcare a little bit more like higher education in schools. How does the state play a role in a system that might be privately provided, but is of importance to the public? How do you manage affordability for families to be able to purchase from that system? And then, from a business perspective, can we think about childcare a little bit more like a benefit? And how do I contribute to that and make it easy for me to be able to build that into my benefits package, part of my standard HR piece that I can do at scale? I think the name of the game in the next 10 years is scale. How do we function at scale?
Yeah. And I guess I would just ask you to also maybe comment on, in some of the research that we did in Milwaukee Succeeds around this issue, we learned that some states were using, I'll call it their lottery money.
Oh, sure.
To pay for childcare, and maybe there are some other sources that maybe here, those of us in Wisconsin might want to consider.
Mm-hmm. I think, we find ourselves in a period of austerity, and, we're going to continue to see, I think, cutting at the federal level. I think that's going to trickle down. There's a lot of open questions about sort of where's the economy going to land. I saw a report that talked about 25% chance we're going into recession, 25% chance we go into a boom. 50-50, we're just going to hang in the middle, and the economy looks a little funky at the moment, whether it's from the tariffs or sort of the changes in the economics that are going on. The housing market looks a little unconventional. And so that raises these questions about, what is the state going to have available to make these investments in the future? But I think one of the things about austerity, and in my experience in talking to folks about schools, but in other areas, is people are willing to pay for things that they think have value and they see directly connected to their lives. And so the states that are looking at things like these middle class subsidies are creating value to voters and the public that will meaningfully reduce the cost of living for young families. That's a big thing that people care about. So there are a lot of different ways you could do that. I mean, you can use it from your general tax fund, but to your point, some states have used lottery revenue to do it. Some folks used a payroll tax to help finance the childcare pieces, sort of using that idea that it's really a workforce issue and connecting it to that. I think there's a state that went to direct referenda to raise taxes, and there might be one that used, in schools we used to talk about the penny on the sales tax. I mean, that's always, a thing that folks can consider. I think connecting the revenue to the value is going to be important for folks in thinking about what is their sort of feeling about taxes and what benefit is it really creating for folks. But in the macro, I think if you look at a lot of our social, political, and economic challenges, it rests in this idea, and I feel it too, that our parents were better off than we were, and their parents were. That we are the first generation of Americans not to be better off than our parents. That there was a time when you could have a single income home and work a union job and go on vacation in the summer up north and send a kid to college. And that world does not exist for people my age. And I worry about what it means for our kids. So to build a strong foundation in future, regardless of party and regardless of ideology, you have to have a thriving middle class. And that means wages that can support families, and it means supports that are going to be meaningful to them. And those two huge costs are housing and childcare. Real hard to be a young family.
Talk a little bit, Jeff, if you would, about access to quality care. Right, the state of Wisconsin uses Youngstar, and he'll explain to you a little bit about what Youngstar is in terms of its rating system for childcare providers. But is the state considering other things or maybe enhancing Youngstar because of the changes that are happening in our economy overall?
Yeah, so I would say it's probably 20 years ago, there was a big movement nationally to create what they call quality rating systems for childcare. And Youngstars is ours. And there's a lot of value in a quality rating system, and it puts a lot of emphasis on the training of teachers and the staff that are there. Health and safety has always been regulated, and so that shows up, but this is really more focused on developmentally appropriate skills and training for the staff. Are they going to give the kids a quality experience geared towards getting them ready for school, which I think is tremendously important. I will also say, having been at the department for 6 years, having done school report cards with you back in the day at the Department of Public Instruction, rating systems have their limits. You can put a lot of data into a system and it may not tell you a lot more than you know from just some real basic gut level indicators about what is important and what isn't. And there can be a lot of bias in that system. There are a lot of folks that care about religious instruction or cultural instruction from their community or bilingual instruction, and those things don't show up in licensing in those areas. And we hear a lot about that from providers, that they feel like this system values things that maybe don't reflect our community's needs and the choices that our parents are making. So we are actually in the process of sort of redesigning Youngstar, engaging with folks, with all the things going on in the world. That process is going to take a little longer than we thought, so that's probably going to lead into the next administration. But I think the thing for folks to think about, my takeaway in 20 years of doing this, is you want a rating system that tells you the essential things clearly. Are the kids safe? Have there been major infractions? Not every nickel and dime thing. Are there big things I need to know about? And then there's things that I think are helpful information for parents that I would argue we shouldn't probably score. I probably want to know, do you do bilingual instruction? Do you have faith as part of your component? What is the programming that you offer? Is it aligned to the school district's curriculum? What's that going to look like if my kid moves into into kindergarten, K-5? Those are the things parents want to know about. And so thinking about a rating system as just a score, I would say I think of the score as sort of the minimum part with the minimum number of things that need to fit into it. And then what are the qualitative things that when parents have a choice, and sometimes they don't because there's not a lot of options, but when they do, that are important to them in making a selection for where they want to send their kids.
So, Jeff, you and I both live in Tulsa, and so some of us who live in more urban settings, these issues may not be as apparent to us, but talk a little bit about kind of the issues that folks in rural areas are really struggling with around early childhood education.
Yeah, and I grew up in Tosa. I live on the east side of Madison, so I don't want to lie about that. Tosa's a little different than when I grew up, I gotta tell you that too. It's a very cool place now. I don't know if it was as hip as when I was growing up. Rural Wisconsin, so there's almost any data point that you care about, if we put it on a map and you lay the major transportation grid of the state over it, so the major highways and freeways, and you look at the data points, they're going to cluster around that transportation grid. Population growth, school enrollment, jobs, earnings, lower average age of families, right? In those rural areas, they're going to be graying, lower populations, and just less access. And I think across the policy spectrum, that is a really fundamental issue for everyone to sort of struggle with, is like, how are we going to ensure that we can meet the needs of rural America? And you're going to have to understand it's going to operate on a different scale and a different cost, and it may look and feel different. You can telehealth some things. We run a very hybrid organization. I can hire very competitive wages in Rhinelander for my staff. But there are some things that require people to be in person. A child welfare safety check is going to take a human. You can do some things, I think, well virtually in education, having lived through the pandemic, personal opinion. In-person instruction matters for folks and for most kids. And that's going to vary, but you got to think about how does this work. And what we see in childcare is it clusters sort of at the cities, even the smaller towns and villages, but it's going to be sort of closer to the population center. And we have whole swaths where there's nothing. The most likely access points for rural areas on childcare are going to be in-home childcare. And that's an important part of our sort of system. It's easier to spin up, it has more access, but again, as we see a shift in the workforce, we see more women in traditional, 9-to-5 jobs, we see fewer folks choosing to stay home and do childcare out of the home. There are about 40% of the total number of providers are in-home providers, but they have 10% of the kids. So when we think about the scale, we're going to have very different scales operating and then very different cost structures. And in an in-home center, before we change the law, you could have up to 8 kids. A maximum of 4 infants, 8 if they're older, or some sliding scale in between. But let's just take that, I'm going to have 4 infants example. Not very many people do it, but let's say I charged $15,000 a kid a year. I would make $60,000. And with that money, I'd have to pay all of my costs, all of my insurance, which is killing childcare right now. The insurance industry is killing childcare right now. It's a huge problem. You got to do the food, all the other pieces, and then you're going to draw a salary. The math gets harder and harder over time for folks to make a living that is sustainable for them. The mortgage, the overhead, all the pieces. And so thinking about, again, how do we make sure that rural folks have access to childcare? How do we have a system that can spin up and be flexible, but also recognize we might have a lot of small providers in rural areas whose economies of scale are not as good as the folks that might be able to run a center that has 150 or 200 kids in it, that can probably pay a higher wage and pay benefits. So we've been talking a lot about what do we learn from farming? Do we need to have co-ops for insurance and administration? How do you make a system of small businesses just sort of functional and thrive in a way that would enable them? We're not going to build centers all across rural Wisconsin. That's not going to happen. But people are still going to live there and they're still going to need childcare. Are we going to see greater co-location with schools in those places? Possibly. We see a lot of that. And the tension point in that space is it is a boon. Schools are often the center of a rural community. Typically in a rural area, you're in either one school building, K through high school, or 2 buildings, a high school and a K-12, and that's it, or a K-8, and that's it. It's the whole district, right? And it's the center of town. But as we build childcare into the school, we also make it competitively much more difficult for them to start childcare. They don't have the same resources and infrastructure. So this is this tension point. It's not, is one better than the other, but there are trade-offs. And the systems start to look different. And so how do we have enough space in the way that we're doing this that it can sort of thrive in a rural space and meet the needs of a densely urban area? Because Milwaukee is also a childcare desert. It has a lot of childcare, but it has a lot more kids. And that's what a childcare desert is. It's a ratio of how many slots of childcare there are to how many kids there are in that community. And so you can have a few kids with no childcare, or you can have lots of kids and a bunch of childcare, but if the ratio is too big, that's really what we mean when we say a childcare desert. It means there just isn't enough access. In the suburbs, those are the like Goldilocks zone of childcare access. Those of you that live in the suburbs, you're the best possible place to be in that, which is still not a great place, but the best possible place in the Goldilocks zone.
All right, well, thank you, Jeff. I see that we've got the signal now to open it up for Q&A. So again, thank you, Secretary Pertl, and we'll take some questions.
And if you two can share that one. All right, thank you both so much for your time today, and we'll now open it up for questions. If anybody does have a question, please start out with an introduction of yourself. You have a question? Come on over.
There you go. Thank you very much. In 1988, so this was a long time ago, I went to work for a company called Marquette Electronics. And it was run by Michael Cudahy, who liked to think out of the box. And although I didn't have any children, one of the first places they took me was the daycare, which was apparently quite revolutionary at the time, which seemed kind of, in hindsight, like a no-brainer, because you had a lot of dads bringing their kids in at, I think, 8 weeks, all the way through kindergarten. It was magnificent. How many other companies, now that was a long time ago, how many other companies are doing that now?
There are companies that do on-site childcare. Quad Graphics, I think, does it. There's Kohl's sometimes does it. It's a range of things. And I think it's an important piece of the mix. What I would say is I don't think it scales particularly well. Large companies with a lot of people in a single location can sometimes do it. The thing I hear from employers is sometimes it's what do I call it? It's not part of their core mission. So the business of running childcare becomes very difficult for them if they're running it in-house. I think they sometimes have success contracting with somebody else to run childcare on site for them. Can work well and can be an important part of the mix. One of the things we hear from parents is sometimes folks really want childcare that's close to home. Parents are working in different locations and they need to be able to share drop off and pick up and some of those pieces. So that sometimes plays into people's preferences. Sometimes companies also contract for slots with a particular provider or a set of providers and say, oh, we have a business relationship here, you get priority or you get an automatic slot with particular childcare providers. But businesses are still really trying to navigate what the sweet spot is on this. I would say in my experience, they want to be part of the solution. They would like that solution to be easier for themselves. And I think for a lot of them running on site, they found to be sometimes challenging, but also very helpful for the staff that are there.
Hi, Jackie, Frederick. You talked a lot about what some other states are doing. I have a lot of colleagues from Europe. They seem to do a much, much, much better job at this. So did you look at what we could learn in countries that are rural and urban, and what would work here?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there's a lot of policy questions that revolve around sort of how does Europe function culturally, and particularly around education and child development than what we see sort of here in America. I'm less clear on the differences of European countries' approaches to childcare pieces. I think the thing I'm most familiar with is the difference in their approach to sort of benefit structures, paid family leave, extended periods of allowing folks to be home, greater flexibility on paid sick leave. Those things also matter in sort of employee sustainability and functionality. Vincent mentioned that I was on the county board. When we were there, we passed paid family leave for our county employees. And what for us was a no-brainer, I think was a function of there are 33 members of the Dane County Board, and I think at the time 12 of us had kids under 10. A governing body that has almost a third of its people with young kids makes very different decisions, I think, than a governing body that is maybe a generation or two removed from that experience. And so putting people who have young families in positions of decision-making authority, I think, tend to lead to better family outcomes. And we see a synergy of that, in part as people are having families later, and then they're further in their career, they're now making decisions that I would argue are more family-friendly, because that's the phase of life that they find themselves in. But we'll definitely look more to some of those European ideas.
Hi, I'm Tim Hunter, and I was kind of caught by your comment about insurance is killing these daycare providers. Would there be any place where the state could provide insurance to daycare? I mean, that would be, you could have a low-cost insurance, and maybe it would just be to small daycare providers to let them go. You know, that would be a great solution to kind of help those out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting conversation. I'm going to sit down with the insurance commissioner here. It's a thing that's really bubbled up in the last few years, but I would say in the last 6 to 8 months, I've heard it in a lot of places across the state. There's really only like 1 or 2 major insurance providers that will insure childcare. And as the costs are going up and the risk pools are changing, it's become a very complicated field. And frankly, I'm not sure that the major providers still want to be in the childcare insuring field, if they think that's a good long-term business decision. And you can't run childcare without insurance. Right? It's like a whole thing. And so it's a conversation that is really sort of just bubbling up to the highest levels, but I think it gets back to these questions of, you know, how do you ensure access? How are you going to ensure that insurance is available? What is it going to mean for cost? What are the different ways the states could intercede in that? But a group insurance, you know, we do it in other areas. It's possible.
Thank you. Peter Hannes. I have a 15-month-old son at home and then one on the way. And so speaking as a parent, one of the pressure points that we feel was availability of daycare. It's not an exaggeration to say my wife took a pregnancy test, found out she was about 6 weeks pregnant, celebrated, and the first thought was, shit, we need to find a daycare center like now. And so we spent hundreds of dollars. We put ourselves on waiting lists at about 6 daycares as far west as Waukesha County, as far south as Franklin, just to try to find a medium point of, you know, we live in Tosa, so just trying to find somewhere that's reasonable. We got really lucky. We ended up finding somewhere in Wauwatosa, but I heard kind of your answer, and the answer is no. But from the state's perspective, what's the thought about opening up more daycare centers that are maybe state-run or state-funded to try to give parents more access to daycare centers?
I mean, I think our answer to that, it depends how you think about the answer to the question. I would argue we want to put a lot more state money into daycare, into childcare centers, and put it into all of them. I think that does help stabilize the field and grow the field. So, you know, there's 25% turnover, but we add a ton of daycares every year. One of the analyses we're really looking at is what is the sort of make or break between a center that's going to be less than 2 to 3 years and those that really persist in that like 7 to 10 year mark. So I think stability is one of them. Access is a key part of this, and there's always a tension on how fast do we regulate something, how tightly does it need to be regulated. You know, bad things sometimes happen in daycare, even the best daycares, especially with young infants. You know, kids under 1 are at the greatest risk of accidents, of SIDS, of all the things that are a parent's nightmare. And so this tension around holding the line on key safety, but also expanding access from a funding and a regulatory side are important. I think the public way that we can do this is continue programs like the child care counts and bridge payments, that we're keeping folks open and helping them start up. It just makes the costs more affordable. I think the other thing, again, becomes these public partnerships. Do schools become part of this? Are they going to hold classrooms? How do they fit into the ecosystem? But you're the classic example. I mean, here all the time. People take the pregnancy test, and then they scramble to find childcare, particularly for the kids under 2. Once your kid's 2, there's probably a slot for childcare somewhere. They start going into other programs. There's going to be capacities. It is serving kids under 2 that is the greatest, like, systemic challenge in the system in terms of capacity.
Hello, Dr. Eve Hall, Greater Milwaukee Urban League. Talk about some of the discussions around the hourly wage of childcare workers, because once again, that is an issue. I don't know what kinds of conversations are going on, but if you could share what may be occurring at this time.
Yeah, so part of how we've been, I mean, so the wages are low, as I said. They were $13.50, I think, in family care a year ago, and I don't know, maybe around $15, $16 an hour on average in the center. And they vary Folks are really, really trying to get into that like 16 to 20 band, which is still not great. But that is sort of the universe in which we currently are operating. The ways in which we've tried to drive that conversation is when we ran childcare counts, there were sort of there was an A and a B program. This is a little wonky, but when they got their money, half of it had to be spent on staff wages, and the other half could be on general administration or staff wages. And I will tell you, in every childcare center I've been in, the answer was, no, I spend all my money on my staff. We've raised wages, we paid bonuses, and this is one of the challenges for the folks that raised wages. As these payments from the state go away, they're going to have to, raise rates to cover that, but they don't think they can go back. Those are competitive wages. Most of them are competing, again, with, and I love my kids, but like, you could shelf, you either shelf at Target or you can, care for kids. That's a mission-driven thing, but one of those two jobs is harder. And the economics do not reflect that, right? The other thing folks did is they pay bonuses every week to people. But those bonuses will go away. And so what you see is a real dollar reduction in what people are earning and taking home. And I think that's going to be a challenge. I think we'll see staff turnover. So this second year of the budget is really going to lay the groundwork for what I think is the future conversation, this third act. What does the next governor propose? What does the next legislature choose to do? And how do they want to approach sort of building this early care system in childcare in a way that works for working families? That is, I think, got to be our North Star. Those are the folks that are struggling, and it's got to be about wages for the workers and cost for the parents. And we can't do it by, there's just a limit to how many kids you can safely put in a room.
All right. Thank you so much.